So we know that the demand curve is a function of the goods price, because we saw that in the last slide. As we changed the price of hamburgers, it created this demand curve, and we know that that demand curve is a function of that price. We know that the price of other goods played a role into it, because what happens if the price of tacos were not the same? What if the price of tacos were $1? Well, that would change that budget constraint, and those budget constraints would have affected the consumer equilibrium, which would have affected that price-quantity pair that we find at consumer equilibrium, which would have affected the price-consumption curve, which affects the demand curve, because the demand curve is basically the price-consumption curve just regraphed, using price on the y-axis and quantity on the horizontal axis, or the x-axis. And we know that income is also a function of the demand function. So the demand function is price of the goods is a function of the goods price, the price of another good, and the income, which make up the budget constraints. So there's a lot of connections there, and hopefully you're starting to understand this. So what could actually change a demand curve? So a demand curve will shift. Something that will actually shift the demand curve, it's going to occur when there is a change in the income or the price of other goods. These are the two economic shifters of demand. And we're going to actually talk about more or less non-economic shifters. There are more shifters of demand, but these are the two main economic shifters, and we're going to focus on these for a little while. So the two main economic shifters of the demand curve are the change in disposable income, the change in that income, or the change in the prices of other goods and services, ceteris paribus, so the price of other goods. We just said it in two different ways. So we know that these two major economic shifters of the demand curve are income and prices of other good. So we've already adjusted, well, what happens if the price of a good changes? What if we adjust income? What's going to happen if we go ahead and adjust income, but we hold prices the same and holding all else the same, or ceteris paribus, that Latin phrase meaning holding all else the same? If we start changing income, then we get into two classes of goods. Two classes of goods that are dictated by income. So these two classes of goods that we're about to discuss, one is known as a normal good, and the other is this inferior good. So what exactly is a normal good? A normal good are goods in which a rise in income will lead to an increased consumption. Something like, if you make more money, you're going to be buying more gasoline. Because if you make more money, maybe you're going on more trips. You're going to go vacationing more. You're going to travel more. You're going to be buying more gasoline. If you start making more money, or as your income improves, you typically like to improve your standard of living. Whereas the higher your income is, you typically will start buying better housing or pay for better housing. Steak is also an example of a normal good. As income rises and you have more disposable income, you typically want to upgrade your food consumption as well. You might be buying more steaks rather than hamburgers. Now, the flip side of a normal good is as your income actually begins to fall, you start actually buying less of these normal goods. So let's think about steak, for example. If you're making $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year, and you can afford steak for every meal, you might prefer steak over hamburger meat every single night. And you might be buying more steak. You would be buying more steak and more fancier food versus if you made $50,000 a year. If you made $50,000 or even $30,000 a year, you can't really afford as much steak, so you consume less steak. These are normal goods, something where as your income rises, you buy more of. If your income falls, you buy less of that good. That's a normal good. The other type of good that we mentioned is an inferior good. So an inferior good are goods in which a rise in income will actually lead to a decreased consumption. Aspects such as bus rides, margarine, and ramen noodles are example of inferior goods. So let's break those down. As your income improves, as you make more money, you can actually afford more gasoline. And maybe you can afford a car to drive you to and from work to where you don't want to take the bus. those bus rides, they're not really that conducive for you. Maybe you'll rather take a taxi and pay a higher price for a taxi or something like that rather than taking a bus ride because you're making more money now. Now, margarine is another example. Margarine is a butter substitute, and it's often cheaper than butter. So as your income falls, maybe you stop buying as much butter and you start buying more margarine because it's cheaper. Ramen noodles is another aspect of an inferior good. So whenever you're a broke college kid, a lot of times you eat a lot of ramen noodles because you can't afford anything really better than ramen noodles. The lower your income is, the actually more ramen noodles you consume. But as you start getting out of college or you go and start working more and you have more money to spend, your consumption of ramen noodles actually begins to fall because you have more money and you stop buying as many ramen noodles. So an inferior good are goods in which a rise in income leads to a decreased consumption, and a decrease in income leads to an increase in consumption. So let's look at our example that we've been using this whole time. So let's say that income increases from $5 to $6. You make more money. What happens if we have our different budget constraints? So here's our original budget line at an income of $5. We have our original budget constraint right here at an income of $5. And then we now have an increase in income. We start getting paid more, and we can now afford $6 for our budget. So as we make more money, what happens to burger consumption? Well, if we draw a straight line down, we see that burger consumption actually goes up. And then what happens to taco consumption? Well, we made more money and taco consumption goes up as well. Given our indifference curves, given our consumer equilibrium, we now consume more tacos and more burgers. So as the income increases from 5 to 6, consumption of burgers and tacos go up. So what are they? Well, they're normal goods. Because remember, a rise in income will lead to increased consumption. Consumption goes up for burgers and tacos as income goes up. Now, what if income goes up from $6 to $8? So it goes up from this budget constraint right here to that budget way out there. We see what happens to burger consumption. Burger consumption goes up. So what does that mean? Burger consumption is a normal good. It's still going up as income goes up. But let's look at what happened to taco consumption. Taco consumption actually falls. So taco consumption falls, so it's actually an inferior good. So let's think about that. As income continuously rises, this individual buys more hamburgers, meaning that it definitely is a normal good. But as income rose, they bought more tacos up to a point and then actually bought less tacos. So tacos were actually a normal good until they reached a budget of about $6. And after that, they started buying less tacos, making it an inferior good. So can that actually happen in real life? Yes, let's think about fast food. The fast food is a normal good for a while until it hits a certain point. If you were on a really low income and couldn't afford fast food, as you increase your income, you might consume more fast food because that's your treat, that's your eating out. But as you obtain even more income, now all of a sudden you can go out to eat at fancy restaurants and fast food doesn't look quite so good. So goods can be normal goods up to a point and then become inferior goods. But in our example, it indicates that there's a strong preference for burgers as income increases. Tacos were a normal good but became an inferior good at a higher level of income, but burgers never lost that normal good status, meaning that there was a stronger preference for burgers even as income increases.